In the entire course of the pandemic, there was only one brave cabinet minister who stuck his head above the COVID parapet and put his morals about nonsensical lockdown policies ahead of career progression. Lord Frost, Boris Johnson's highly respected Brexit minister, who helped deliver a successful deal with the EU, stunned the PM when he quit the cabinet in December over the introduction of Plan B, what I've always called Plan BS. It was his bold stance, coupled with the mass Tory backbench rebellion, which saved the country from entering a completely unnecessary Omicron lockdown last Christmas, which was being pushed by the Cabinet's lockdown fanatics and SAGE's restriction-obsessed scientists, including Chris Whitty. And it's a pleasure to have him here tonight. So, Lord Frost, why did the government react so hysterically to Omicron, when all of the evidence from South Africa actually made it very clear that this variant was far milder and could actually be, as has turned out to be the case, a good thing?
Yeah, great to be here, Dan. It's a very good question, and I ask myself that quite often. I don't know why. It's not at all clear. Even from the early days in mid-December, it was pretty clear that the Omicron variant was weaker. We knew that from South Africa. I was surprised by Chris Whitty's statement in December that everything we know about Omicron was bad, because that didn't seem to be justified by the evidence. And it looked like we were just on autopilot. Obviously, at that point, I already made clear I was leaving over Plan B and vaccine passports, which was the point of principle for me. But it looked like we were on autopilot down the slippery slope again to a lockdown. And I'm very glad if I played a small part in preventing that happen. That's great.
I think you played more than a small part, and we are very grateful for it, because I do have to admit, Lord Frost, it was one of my frustrations throughout this pandemic that there seemed to be so little pushback from the cabinet against the dodgy modelling, against the hysterical epidemiologists. And I need to understand why that was the case.
So I mean, I don't want to give away secrets, and I shouldn't, but I think it's hardly a secret that the evidence at times was presented kind of late in excessive detail, and that there never was much of an effort to kind of trade off the economic effects, the social effects against the health effects. And if you're a departmental minister who's doing a day job, and you're presented with this, then you've got to be very confident of your own judgment to say that all these experts have got it wrong, and I'm right. And I think that's why this went on for so long. I do think, to me, one of the most troubling things of this whole last 2 years is the fact that it took so long for us to come out of lockdown and from these measures. I don't find it so surprising that we initially went into it. But as the evidence changed and as it became clearer that COVID was not so dangerous, that the vaccines worked effectively, and so on, the reaction didn't seem to adjust to that. And I still find that quite surprising. But I think what I've just said is one of the reasons. People were looking elsewhere, they had other things, and you tend to defer to the experts unless you're 100% sure of your judgment.
Was there a psychological aspect, Lord Frost, with the Prime Minister himself nearly dying from COVID-19? Because, of course, Boris always presented himself as a great libertarian, but throughout 2020, he seemed to fundamentally change.
So I'm not sure. I don't really remember the PM being that different when he came back. Obviously, he was a little tired. That's understandable. But I don't really remember, a great difference in him. He was pretty ebullient, pretty keen to get on with things, and I think, his libertarian instincts were always there. I think, you take a lot of responsibility when you're Prime Minister. You have to make some really major judgments, and it's not that surprising that there's a pressure to err on the side of caution. So I don't think it was. I mean, it's always difficult to guess other people's psychological sort of development, but I don't think it was that. I think it was just simpler questions of policy making really that were the cause of this.
And it really feels like cabinet decision making changed over the course of lockdown. You know, one of the great things about our Westminster system is that you have collective cabinet responsibility, but you should be able to go into that room and lock horns, knock heads together. But that wasn't happening during COVID because it was all done remotely. And tell me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like all of the decisions were made and cabinet became almost a rubber stamping process.
So I think, lots of the decisions had to be made really quickly. So that's always part of the process in these circumstances. I think remote meetings probably did have some effect. You don't have the kind of dynamics that develop, although by the time I was in the cabinet, it was getting back to normal. I do think in the end, cabinet ministers have got to take responsibility. You can't say that. I mean, some people said to me after I left, "Why did you go? COVID's not your job. You should focus on what is your job." But some things are bigger than that. COVID, our response to COVID was about how we govern this country overall. You can't say, if a question of war and peace appears, you can't say, well, that's for the Ministry of Defence, I don't take a view on it. Some things are just too big. And COVID was too big, and I think everyone had a responsibility to take a view. And in the end, there was a point of principle that I knew I'd never be able to support vaccine passports. I think they're the wrong thing. And when that decision was taken, I knew I could stay.
There's a couple of specific points I want to pick up with you about government policy to do with COVID. The first was this extraordinary propaganda campaign. I call it propaganda. I guess the government would call it public health information. But they spent literally tens or even hundreds of millions of pounds, actually, to terrify the population with really scary messages that weren't always backed up in science. You could argue when we didn't know about coronavirus, maybe in sort of March 2020, there could have been a justification for it. But this advertising continued for months and months and months. Did you have an issue with it, the so-called nudge unit?
So I think the messaging, it's pretty clearly understood, I think, that in the early days, the government was worried that the population wouldn't listen and therefore maybe kind of over-egged it. I think, the nudge unit's been part of government for 10 years, so its involvement isn't itself kind of sinister thing. And I think some of the things that have been said about it probably overstate its role. I do think the messaging has been, over-alarmist for too long and not connected to the real risks. And even now, we're still hearing messaging on the underground, for example, telling us how everything's been cleaned and surfaces been, dealt with. But we know that's nothing to do with it. But, still the autopilot continues, and we must stop this if we're going to get back to normal.
And then finally, I just wanted to look at all of these really nonsensical rules. So plastic sheet coverings, Scotch eggs, the 10 p.m. curfew, all things that made absolutely no difference to the spread of coronavirus. But the government seemed very addicted to them when actually, surely the focus should have been on the vaccine rollout, the antivirals, things that really made a difference to treating COVID-19 in the vulnerable.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we knew within a couple of months, obviously, that, the very alarmist opinions about how COVID was transmitted weren't really borne out. And at that point, the government should have stopped some of these, kind of obsessional measures, taping off park benches and so on, that everyone could see were doing far more harm than good. I think it's a good example, actually, what tends to happen in government quite often, that you in coming up with an idea, passing a law, it gets overcomplicated. People try to pin down every situation. They kind of write everything in, and mostly people don't notice that because it's specialist. But COVID affected everyone, and suddenly, we're all exposed to this kind of obsessional trying to tell us what to do the whole time, and it's going to take us a long time to get over this, and we've really got to try hard now.